reading Theory of Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality by Siegfried Kracauer. Introduction. Photography. This study rests upon the assumption that each medium has a specific nature which invites certain kinds of communications while obstructing others. Even philosophers of art concentrating on what is common to all the arts cannot help referring to the existence and possible impact of such differences. In her Philosophy in a New Key, Suzanne Langer hesitantly admits that, quote, the medium in which we naturally conceive our ideas may restrict them not only to certain forms but to certain fields, end quote. But how can we trace the nature of the photographic medium, end quote, or question mark? A phenomenological description based on intuitive insight will hardly get at the core of the matter. Historical movements cannot be grasped with the aid of concepts formed, so to speak, in a vacuum. Rather, analysis must build from the views held of photography in the course of its evolution, views which in some way or other must reflect actually existing trends and practices. It would therefore seem advisable first to study the historically given ideas and concepts. Now, this book is not intended as a history of photography, nor of film for that matter. So it will suffice for our purposes to scrutinize only two sets of ideas about photography: those entertained in the early stages of development and relevant present-day notions. Should the thoughts of the pioneers and of modern photographers and critics happen to center on approximately the same problems, the same essentials, this would bear out the proposition that photography has specific properties and thus lend vigor to the assumption about the peculiar nature of media in general. Such similarities between views and trends of different eras should even be expected, for the principles and ideas instrumental in the rise of a new historical entity do not just fade away once the period of inception is over. On the contrary, it is as if, in the process of growing and spreading, that entity were destined to bring out all their implications. Aristotle's theory of tragedy is still being used as a valid starting point for interpretation. A great idea, says Whitehead, quote, is like a phantom ocean beating upon the shores of human life in successive waves of specialization, end quote. The following historical survey, then, is to provide the substantive conceptions on which the subsequent systematic considerations proper will depend. Historical survey. Early views and trends. With the arrival of daguerreotypy, discerning people were highly aware of what they felt to be the new medium's specific properties, which they unanimously identified as the camera's unique ability to record as well as reveal visible or potentially visible physical reality. There was general agreement that photography reproduces nature with a fidelity, quote, equal to nature itself, end quote. In supporting the bill for the purchase of Daguerre's invention by the French government, Arago and Gay-Lussac revealed in the quote mathematical exactness end quote and quote unimaginable precision end quote of every detail rendered by the camera, and they predicted that the medium would benefit both science and art. Paris correspondents of New York newspapers and periodicals chimed in, full of praise for the unheard of accuracy with which the daguerreotypes copied, quote, stones under the water at the edge of the stream, end quote, or a, quote, withered leaf lying on a projecting cornice, end quote. And no less a voice than Ruskin's was added to the chorus of enthusiasm over the quote sensational realism end quote of small plates with views of Venice. It is, said he, quote, as if a magician had reduced the reality to be carried away into the enchanted land, end quote. In their ardor, these 19th century realists were emphasizing an essential point, that the photographer must indeed reproduce somehow the objects before his lens, that he definitely lacks the artist's freedom to dispose of existing shapes and spatial interrelationships for the sake of his inner vision. Recognition of the camera's recording faculty went together with with an acute awareness of its revealing power. Gay-Lussac insisted that no detail, quote, even if imperceptible, end quote, can escape, quote, the eye and the brush of this new painter, end quote. In as early as 1839, a New York Star reporter admiringly remarked that when viewed under a magnifying glass, photographs show minutiae which the naked eye would never have discovered. The American writer and physician Oliver Wendell Holmes was among the first to capitalize on the camera's scientific potentialities. In the early 60s, he found that the movements of walking people, as disclosed by instantaneous photographs, differed greatly from what the artist imagined they were. And on the grounds of his observations, he criticized an artificial leg then popular with amputated Civil War veterans. Other scientists followed suit. For The Expression of the Emotion in Man and Animals, 1872, Darwin preferred photographs to engravings and snapshots to time exposures, arguing that he was concerned with truth rather than beauty, and snapshots could be relied upon to convey the, quote, most evanescence and fleeting facial expressions, end quote. Many an invention of consequence has come into being well nigh unnoticed. Photography was born under a lucky star inasmuch as it appeared at a time when the ground was well prepared for it. The insight into the recording and revealing functions of this, quote, mirror with a memory, end quote, its inherent realistic tendency, that is, owed much to the vigor with which the forces of realism bore down on the romantic movement of the period. In 19th century France, the rise of photography coincided with the spread of positivism, an intellectual attitude rather than a philosophical school, which, shared by many thinkers, discouraged metaphysical speculation in favor of a scientific approach, and thus was in perfect keeping with the ongoing processes of industrialization. Within this context, only the aesthetic implications of this attitude are of interest. positivist mentality aspired to be, or positivist mentality aspired to a faithful, completely impersonal rendering of reality, in the sense of Taine's radical dictum, quote, I want to reproduce the objects as they are, or as they would be even if I did not exist, end quote. What counted was not so much the artist's subject matter or easily deceptive imagination as his unbiased objectivity in representing the visible world. Hence, the simultaneous breakthrough of plein air painting devoid of romantic overtones. Yet, of course, despite their emphatic insistence on truth to reality, the intellectual boheme would expect such truth to serve the cause of the revolution temporarily defeated in 1848. A few years later, Courbet called himself both a, quote, partisan of revolution, end quote, and a, quote, sincere friend of real truth, end quote. It was inevitable that this turn to realism in art, which gained momentum with Courbet's burial at Ornans 1850 and had its short heyday after the scandal roused by Madame Bovary 1857, should bring photography into focus. Was the camera not an ideal means of reproducing and penetrating nature without any distortions? Leading scientists, artists, and critics were predisposed to grasp and acknowledge the peculiar virtues of the emergent medium. However, the views of the realist met with strong opposition, not only in the camp of the artist, but among the photographers themselves. Art, the opponents held, did not exhaust itself in painterly or photographic records of reality. It was more than that. It actually involved the artist's creativity in shaping the given material. In 1853, Sir William Newton suggested that the photographic image could and should be altered so as to make the result conform to the, quote, acknowledged principles of fine art, end quote. His suggestion was heeded. Not content with what they believed to be a mere copying of nature, numerous photographers aimed at pictures which, as an English critic claimed, would delineate beauty instead of merely representing truth. Incidentally, it was not primarily the many painters in the ranks of the photographers who voiced and implemented such aspirations. With notable exceptions, the, quote, artist photographers, end quote, of those days followed a tendency which may be called, quote, formative, end quote, since it sprang from their urge freely to compose beautiful pictures rather than to capture nature in the raw. But their creativity invariably manifested itself in photographs that reflected value painterly styles and preferences, consciously or not. They imitated traditional art, not fresh reality. Thus, the sculptor Adam Solomon, a top-ranking artist photographer, excelled in portraits which, because of their, quote, Rembrandt lighting, end quote, and velvet drapery, caused the poet Lamartine to recant his initial opinion that photographs were nothing but a, quote, plagiarism of nature, end quote. Upon seeing these pictures, Lamartine felt sure that photography was equally capable of attaining the peaks of art. What happened on a relatively high level became firmly established in the lower depths of commercial photography. A host of would-be artist photographers catered to the taste of the Jazmine, which, hostile to realism, still went for romantic painting and the academic idealism of Ingres and his school. There was no end of prints capitalizing on the appeal of stage genre scenes, historical or not. Photography developed into a lucrative industry, especially in the field of portraiture, in which Disderi set a widely adopted pattern. From 1852, his portrait carte de visite ingratiated itself with the petit bourgeois, who felt elated at the possibility of acquiring, at low cost, his likeness, a privilege hitherto reserved for the aristocracy and the well-to-do upper middle class. As might be expected, Disderi too preached the gospel of beauty. It met the needs of the market. Under the Second Empire, professional photographers, no less than popular painters, sacrificed truth to conventional pictorialness by embellishing the features of their less attractive clients. All this means that such concern with art led the artist photographers to neglect, if not deliberately to defy, the properties of their medium, as perceived by the realist. As far back as 1843, daguerreotypists renounced camera explorations of reality for the sake of soft-focus pictures. Adam Solomon relied on retouching for artistic effect, and Julia Margaret Cameron availed herself of badly made lenses in order to get at the quote spirit end quote of the person portrayed without the disturbing interference of quote accidental end quote detail. Similarly, Henry Peach Robinson encouraged the use of any kind of quote dodge, trick, and conjuration end quote so that pictorial beauty might arise out of a quote mixture of the real and the artificial end quote. Small wonder that the champions of realism and their adversaries engaged in a lively debate. This famous controversy, which raged in the second half of the 19th century with no clear-cut solution ever being reached, rested upon a belief common to both schools of thought that photographs were copies of nature. Yet, there the agreement ended. Opinions clashed when it came to appraising the aesthetic significance of reproductions which light itself seemed to have produced. The realist, it is true, refrained from identifying photography as an art in its own right. In fact, the extremists among them were inclined to discredit artistic endeavors altogether, but strongly insisted that the camera's incorruptible objectivity was a precious aid to the artist. Photography, as a realist-minded critic put it, reminds the artist of nature and thus serves him as an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Taine and even Delacroix express themselves in similar terms. The latter compared daguerreotype to a, quote, dictionary, end quote, of nature and advised painters diligently to consult it. Those in the opposite camp naturally rejected the idea that a medium confining itself to mechanical imitation could provide artistic sensations or help achieve them. Their contempt of this inferior medium was mingled with bitter complaints about its growing influence, which they contended lent support to the cult of realism, thereby proving detrimental to elevated art. Baudelaire scorned the worshippers of Daguerre among the artists. He claimed they just pictured what they saw instead of projecting their dreams. The artist photographers shared these views with a difference. They were confident that photography need not be limited to reproduction, pure and simple. Photography, they reasoned, is a medium which offers the creative artist as many opportunities as does painting or literature, provided he does not let himself be inhibited by the camera's peculiar affinities, but uses every, quote, dodge, trick, and conjuration, end quote, to elicit beauty from the photographic raw material. All these 19th century arguments and counter-arguments now sound oblique. Misled by the naive realism underlying them, both sides failed to appreciate the kind and degree of creativeness that may go into a photographic record. Their common outlook prevented them from penetrating the essence of a medium which is neither imitation nor art in the traditional sense. Yet still, as those old notions have become the two divergent tendencies from which they drew strength, continue to assert themselves. Current views and trends. Of the two camps in which modern photography is split, one follows the realistic tradition. True, Taine's intention to reproduce the objects as they are definitely belongs to the past. The present-day realists have learned or relearned that reality is what is as we see it. That reality is as we see it. But much as they are aware of this, they resemble the 19th century realist in that they enhance the camera's recording and revealing abilities and accordingly consider it their task as photographers to make the, quote, best statement of facts, end quote. The late Edward Weston, for instance, highly valued the unique precision with which instantaneous photography mechanically registers fine detail and the, quote, unbroken sequence of infinitely subtle gradations from black to white, end quote. A testimony which carries all the more weight since he often indulges in wresting abstract compositions from nature. It is evident that Weston refers to camera revelations rather than representations of familiar sights. What thrills us today, then, is the power of the medium, so greatly increased by technical innovations and scientific discoveries, to open up new, hitherto unsuspected dimensions of reality. Even though the late Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was anything but a realist, he extolled records capturing objects from unusual angles or combinations of phenomena never before seen together. The fabulous disclosures of high speed micro and macro photography, the penetrations obtained by means of infrared emulsions, etc. Photography, he declares, is the quote golden key opening the doors to the wonders of the external universe, end quote. Is this a poetic exaggeration? Question mark. In his book Schöpfung aus dem Wassertropfen, Creation Out of a Water Drop, the German photographer Gustav Schenk uncovers the Lilliputian world contained in a square millimeter of moving plain water, an endless succession of shapes so fantastic that they seem to have been dreamed rather than found. In thus showing the quote wonders of the external universe, end quote, realistic photography has taken on two important functions unforeseeable in its earlier stages of development. This may explain why, for instance, Macaulay Nagy's account of contemporary camera work breathes a warmth and a sense of participation absent in pertinent 19th century statements. First, modern photography has not only considerably enlarged our vision, but in doing so, adjusted it to man's situation in a technological age. A conspicuous feature of this situation is that the viewpoints and perspectives that framed our images of nature for long stretches of the past have become relative. In a crudely physical sense, we are moving about with the greatest of ease and incomparable speed, so that stable impressions yield to ever-changing ones. Bird's eye views of terrestrial landscapes have become quite common. Not one single object has retained a fixed, definitely recognizable appearance. The same applies to phenomena on the ideological plane. Given to analysis, we pass in review and break down into comparable elements all the complex value systems that have come to us in the form of beliefs, ideas, or cultures, thereby, of course, weakening their claim to absoluteness. So we find ourselves increasingly surrounded by mental configurations which we are free to interpret at will. Each is iridescent with meanings, while the great beliefs or ideas from which they issue grow paler. Similarly, photography has effectively impressed upon us the dissolution of traditional perspectives. Think of the many prints picturing unwanted aspects of reality. Spatial depth and flatness are strangely intertwined, and objects apparently well known turn into inscrutable patterns. All in all, the realists among the modern photographers have done much to synchronize our vision with topical experiences in other dimensions. That is, they have made us perceive the world we actually live in. No mean achievement, considering the power of resistance inherent in habits of seeing. In fact, some such habits stubbornly survive. For instance, the predilection which many people show today for wide vistas and panoramic views may well go back to an era less dynamic than ours. Second, Precisely by exploding perceptual traditions, modern photography has assumed another function, that of influencing art. Marcel Duchamp relates that in 1912, when he was painting his nude descending the staircase, Paris art circles were stimulated by stroboscopic and multiple exposure high-speed photographs. What a change in the relationships between photography and painting. Unlike 19th century photography, which at best served as an aid to artists eager to be true to nature, nature still conceived in terms of time-honored visual conventions. Scientific camera explorations of the first decades of the 20th century were a source of inspiration to artists, who then began to defy these conventions. It sounds paradoxical that, of all media, realistic photography should thus have contributed to the rise of abstract art. But the same technological advance that made possible photographs bring our vision, so to speak, up to date, or I'll read it back. But the same technological advance that made possible photographs bringing our vision, so to speak, up to date has left its imprint upon painters and prompted them to break away from visual schemata felt to be obsolete. Nor is it in the final analysis surprising that the achievements in the two media do coincide up to a point. Contemporary photographic records and painterly abstractions have this in common. They are both remote from the images we have been able to form of reality in a technically more primitive age. Hence the quote abstract end quote character of those records in the surface similarity to them of certain modern paintings. Yet, as in the old days, formative urges still vie with realistic intentions. Although Macaulay Nagy delights in the visual conquest of realistically handled photography and readily acknowledges their impact on art, he is nevertheless much more concerned with emancipating the medium from the quote narrow rendering of nature end quote. His guiding idea is that we should learn to consider photography no less than painting an quote ideal instrument of visual expression end quote. Quote, we want to create end quote, he exclaims. Consequently, he capitalized, as did Man Ray, on the sensitivity to light of the photographic plate to produce black and white compositions from purposefully controlled material. All modern experimental photographers proceed in essentially the same way. It is as if they suffered from their obligations toward nature in the raw, as if they felt that to be artists, they would have to work the given raw material into creations of an expressive rather than reproductive order. So they use and often combine various artifices and techniques, among them negatives, photograms, multiple exposure, solarization, reticulation, etc., in order to mount pictures which are palpably designed to externalize what Leo Katz, an experimental photographer, calls, quote, our subjective experiences, our personal visions, and the dynamics of our imagination, end quote. No doubt these artistic minded experimenters aspire to photographic values. Significantly, they refrain from retouching as an interface with the alleged purity of their laboratory procedures. And yet, they are clearly the descendants of the 19th century artist photographers, much as they may be reluctant to imitate painterly styles and motifs after the manner of their predecessors. They still aim at achieving art in the traditional sense. Their products could also be patterned on abstract or surrealist paintings. Moreover, exactly like the early champions of pictorialism, they tend to neglect the specific properties of the medium. In 1925, it is true, Macaulay Nagy still referred to astronomical and X-ray photographs as prefigurations of his photograms, but meanwhile the umbilical cord, tenuous anyway between realistic and experimental photography, seems to have been completely severed. Andre Feininger suggests that, quote, superfluous and disturbing details, end quote, should be suppressed for the sake of, quote, artistic simplification, end quote. The goal of photography as an art medium, he stipulates, is, quote, not the achievement of highest possible, quote, likeness, end quote, of the depicted subject, but the creation of an abstract work of art featuring composition instead of documentation, end quote. He is not the only one to discount the, quote, wonders of the external universe, end quote. In the interest of self-expression, in a publication on the German experimental photographer Otto Steinert, the latter's so-called, quote, subjective, end quote, photography is characterized as a deliberate departure from the realistic point of view. All of this implies that the meaning of photography is still controversial. The great 19th century issue of whether or not photography is an art medium, or at least can be developed into one, fully retains its topical flavor. When tackling this perennial issue, the modern realists are wavering. In their desire to highlight the artistic potentialities of their medium, they usually draw attention to the photographer's selectivity, which indeed may account for Prince suggestive of his personal vision and rich in aesthetic gratifications. But is he for that reason on a par with the painter or poet? Question mark. And is his product a work of art in the strict sense of the word? Question mark. Regarding these crucial questions, there is a great deal of soul searching in the realist camp, affirmative testimony alternating with resignation over the limitations which the medium imposes upon its adepts. No such ambivalence is found among the experimental photographers. They cut the Gordian knot by insisting that renderings of chance reality, however beautiful, cannot possibly be considered art. Art begins, they argue, where dependence upon uncontrollable conditions ends, and in intentionally ignoring the camera's recording task. Finninger and the others tried to transform photography into the art medium which they claimed it to be. Toward the end of 1951, the New York Times published an article by Lisette Model in which she turned against experimental photography, pronouncing herself in favor of a, quote, straight approach to life, end quote. The reactions to her statement, published in the same newspaper, strikingly demonstrate that the slightest I'll read it back. The reactions to her statement, published in the same newspaper, strikingly demonstrate that the slightest provocation suffices to revive hostilities between the defenders of realism and of unfettered creativity. One letter writer who described himself as a, quote, frankly experimental photographer, end quote, blamed Miss Model for arbitrarily curtailing the artist's freedom to use the medium as he pleases. A second reader endorsed her article on the strength of the argument that, quote, photographers work best within the limitations of the medium, end quote. And a third preferred not to advance an opinion at all because, quote, any attempt to formalize and sharply define the function of our art can only lead to stagnation, end quote. Skirmishes such as these prove that belligerents are as far apart as ever before. In sum, the views and trends that marked the beginnings of photography have not changed much in the course of its evolution. To be sure, its techniques and contents have, but that is beside the point here. Throughout the history of photography, there is on the one side a tendency toward realism culminating in records of nature, and on the other, a formative tendency aiming at artistic creations. Often enough, formative aspirations clash with the desire to render reality overwhelmingly it in the process. Photography, then, is the arena of two tendencies which may well conflict with each other. This state of things raises the aesthetic problems to which we now must turn. Systematic considerations. The basic aesthetic principle. It may be assumed that the achievements within a particular medium are all the more satisfying aesthetically if they build from the specific properties of that medium. To express the same in negative terms, a product which somehow goes against the grain of its medium, say by imitating effects more, quote, natural, end quote, to other medium, will hardly prove acceptable. The old iron structures, with their borrowings from Gothic stone structure, are as irritating as they are venerable. The pull of the properties of photography is, perhaps, responsible for the inconsistent attitudes and performances of some photographers with strong painterly inclinations. Robinson, the early artist photographer who recommended that truth should be sacrificed to beauty, at the same time eulogized as if under a compulsion the medium's unrivaled truth to reality. He also belongs the duality in Edward Weston's work, devoted to both abstraction and realism. He paid tribute to the later's superiority only after having become aware of their incompatibility and of his split allegiance. Yet this emphasis on a medium's peculiarities give rise to serious objections, one of which may be formulated as follows. The properties of a medium elude concise definition. It is therefore inadmissible to postulate such properties and use them as a starting point for aesthetic analysis. What is adequate to a medium cannot be determined dogmatically in advance. Any revolutionary artist may upset all previous speculations about the, quote, nature, end quote, of the medium to which his works belong. On the other hand, however, experience shows that not all media obstruct a definition of their nature with equal vigor. In consequence, one may arrange the different media along a continuum according to the degree of the elusiveness of their properties. One pole of the continuum can be assigned, for instance, to painting, whose varying modes of approach seems to be least dependent upon the fixed material and technical factors. Lessing's great attempt in his Laocoon to delineate the boundaries between painting and poetry suffered from his inability to gauge the potentialities of either art. But this does not invalidate his attempt. Notwithstanding their near intangibility, these boundaries make themselves felt whenever a painter or poet tries to transfer to his own medium statements advanced in the other. Quote, "There are many things beautiful enough in words," end quote, remarks Benvenuto Cellini, roughly anticipating Lessing, quote, "which do not match well when executed by an artist," end quote. That the theater is more restrictive than painting is strikingly demonstrated by an experience of Eisenstein. At a time when he still directed theatrical plays, he found out by trial and error that stage conditions could not be stretched infinitely, that in effect their inexorable nature prevented him from implementing his artistic intentions, which then called for film as the only fitting means of expression. So he left the theater for the cinema. Nor does, at least in our era, the novel readily lend itself to all kinds of uses. Hence the recurrent quest for its essential features. Ortega y Gasset compares it to a, quote, "vast but finite query," end quote. But if any medium has its legitimate place at the pole opposite that of painting, it is photography. The properties of photography, as defined by Gay-Lussac and Arago at the outset, are fairly specific, and they have lost nothing of their impact in the course of history. Thus, it seems all the more justifiable to apply the basic aesthetic principle to this particular medium. Since hybrid genres drawing on photography are practically non-existent, the problem of their possible aesthetic validity does not pose itself. Compliance with the basic aesthetic principle carries implications for 1. The photographer's approach to his medium. 2. The affinities of photography. And 3. The peculiar appeals of photographs. The photographic approach. The photographer's approach may be called, quote, photographic, end quote, if it conforms to the basic aesthetic principle. In an aesthetic interest, that is, he must follow the realistic tendency under all circumstances. That is, of course, a minimum requirement. Yet, in meeting it, he will at least have produced prints in keeping with the photographic approach, which means that an impersonal, completely artless camera record is aesthetically irreproachable, whereas an otherwise beautiful and perhaps significant composition may lack photographic quality. Artless compliance with the basic principle has its rewards, especially in case of pictures adjusting our vision to our actual situation. Pictures of this kind need not result from deliberate efforts on the part of the photographer to give the impression of artistic creations. In fact, Beaumont Newhall refers to the intrinsic, quote, beauty, end quote, of aerial serial photographs taken with automatic cameras during the last war for strictly military purposes. It is understood that this particular brand of beauty is an unintended byproduct which adds nothing to the aesthetic legitimacy of such mechanical explorations of nature. But if candid shots are true to the medium, it would seem natural to imagine the photographer as a, quote, camera eye, end quote, a man devoid of formative impulses who is all in all the exact counterpart of the type of artist proclaimed in the Realistic Manifesto of 1856. According to the manifesto, the artist's attitude toward reality should be so impersonal that he might reproduce the same subject 10 times without any of his copies showing the slightest difference. This is how Proust conceives of the photographer in the passage of the Guermantes Way, where, after a long absence, the narrator enters, unannounced, the living room of his grandmother. Block quote. I was in the room, or rather, I was not yet in the room since she was not aware of my presence, of myself. There was present only the witness, the observer with a hat and traveling coat, the stranger who does not belong to the house, the photographer who is called to take a photograph of places which one will never see again. The process that mechanically occurred in my eyes when I caught sight of my grandmother was indeed a photograph. We never see the people who are dear to us save in the animated system, the perceptual motion of our incessant love for them, which before allowing the images that their faces present to us catches them in its vortex, flings them back upon the idea that we have always had of them, makes them adhere to it, coincide with it. How, since into the forehead, the cheeks of my grandmother, I had been accustomed to read all the most delicate, the most permanent qualities of her mind, how, since every casual glance is an act of necromancy, each face that we love in mirror of the past, how could I have failed to overlook what in her had become dulled and changed, seeing that in the most trivial spectacles of our daily life, our eye, charged with thought, neglects, as would a classical tragedy, every image that does not assist the action of the play and retains only those that may help to make its purpose intelligible. I, for whom my grandmother was still myself, I, who had never seen her save in my own soul, always at the same place in the past, through the transparent sheets of contiguous, overlapping memories, suddenly in our drawing room, which formed part of a new world, that of a time, saw, sitting on the sofa, beneath the lamp, red-faced, heavy in common, sick, lost in thought, following the lines of a book with eyes that seemed hardly sane, a dejected old woman whom I did not know. End of block quote. Proust starts from the premise that love blinds us to the changes which the beloved object is undergoing in the course of time. It is therefore logical that he should emphasize emotional detachment as the photographer's foremost virtue. He drives home this point by comparing the photographer with the witness, the observer, the stranger, three types supposed not to be entangled in the events they happen to watch. They may perceive anything because nothing they see is pregnant with memories that would captivate them and thus limit their vision. The ideal photographer is the opposite of the unseeing lover. He resembles the indiscriminating mirror. He is identical with the camera lens. Photography, Proust has it, is the product of complete alienation. The one-sidedness of this definition is obvious, yet the whole context suggests that Proust was primarily concerned with the depiction of a state of mind in which the impact of involuntary memories blurs the external phenomena touching them off, and the desire to contrast in the interest of clarity this state of mind with the photographer's may have led him to adopt the credo of the extreme 19th century realist, according to which the photographer, any artist for that matter, holds a mirror up to nature. Actually, there is no mirror at all. Photographs do not just copy nature, but metamorphose it by transferring three-dimensional phenomena to the plane, severing their ties with the surroundings, and substituting black, gray, and white for the given color schemes. Yet, if anything defies the idea of a mirror, it is not so much these unavoidable transformations, which may be discounted because in spite of them, photographs still preserve the character of compulsory reproductions, as the way in which we take cognizance of visible reality. Even Proust's alienated photographer spontaneously structures the inflowing impressions, the simultaneous perceptions of his other senses, certain perceptual form categories inherent in his nervous system, and not least his general dispositions prompt him to organize the visual raw material in the act of seeing, and the activities in which he thus unconsciously engages are bound to condition the pictures he is taking. But what about the candid photographs mentioned above, prints obtained almost automatically? In their case, it falls to the spectator to the structuring. In their case, it falls to the spectator to do the structuring. The aerial reconnaissance photos referred to by Newhall interfere with the conventional structuring processes because of their unidentifiable shapes, which cause the spectator to draw into the aesthetic dimension. Objectivity, in the sense of the realist manifesto, is unattainable. This being so, there is no earthly reason why the photographer should suppress his formative faculties in the interest of the necessarily futile attempt to achieve that objectivity. Provided his choices are governed by his determination to record and reveal nature, he is entirely justified in selecting motif, frame, lens, filter, emulsion, and grain according to his sensibilities. Or rather, he must be selective in order to transcend the minimum requirement, for nature is likely to give itself upon him, for nature is unlikely to give itself up to him if he does not absorb it with all his senses strained and his whole being participating in the process. The formative tendency, then, does not have to conflict with the realistic tendency. Quite the contrary, it may help substantiate and fulfill it, an interaction of which the 19th century realist could not possibly be aware. Contrary to what Proust says, the photographer sees things in his quote own soul, end quote. And yet Proust is right in relating the photographic approach to a state of alienation. Even though the photographer who acknowledges the properties of his medium rarely, if ever, shows the emotional detachment which Proust describes to him, he cannot freely externalize his inner vision either. What counts is the quote right, end quote, mixture of his realist loyalties and formative endeavors, a mixture, that is, in which the latter, however strongly developed, surrender their independence to the former. As Lewis Mumford puts it, the photographer's quote inner impulse, instead of spreading itself in subjective fantasy, must always be in key with other circumstances, end quote. Some early artist photographers, such as Nader, David Octavius Hill, and Robert Adamson, knew how to establish this precarious balance. Much as they were influenced by painting, they primarily aimed at bringing out the essential features of any person presented. The photographic quality of their portraits, says Newhall, must be traced to the, quote, dignity and depth of their perception, end quote. This means that the photographer's selectivity is of a kind which is closer to empathy than to disengaged spontaneity. He resembles, perhaps most of all, the imaginative reader intent on studying and deciphering an elusive text. Like a reader, the photographer is steeped in the book of nature. His, quote, intensity of vision, end quote, claims Paul Strand, should be rooted in a, quote, real respect for the thing in front of him, end quote. Or, in Watson's words, the camera, quote, provides the photographer with a means of looking deeply into the nature of things and presenting his subjects in terms of their basic reality, end quote. Due to the revealing power of the camera, there is also something of an explorer about him. Insatiable curiosity stirs him to roam yet unconquered expanses and capture the strange patterns in them. The photographer summons up his being, not to discharge it in autonomous creations, but to dissolve it into the substances of the objects that close in on him. Once again, Proust is right selectively within the medium. This medium is inseparable from processes of alienation. Let me insert here an observation on the possible role of melancholy in photographic vision. It is certainly not by accident that Newhall, in his History of Photography, mentions on two different occasions melancholy in conjunction with pictorial work in a photographic spirit. Okay, I'll read it over. Let me insert here an observation on the possible role of melancholy in photographic vision. It is certainly not by accident that Newhall, in his History of Photography, mentions on two different occasions melancholy in connection with pictorial work in a photographic spirit. He remarks that Marville's pictures of the Paris streets and houses doomed under Napoleon III have the, quote, melancholy beauty of a vanished past, end quote. And he says of Atget's Paris street scenes that they are impregnated with the, quote, melancholy that a good photograph can so powerfully evoke, end quote. Now, melancholy as an inner disposition not only makes elegiac objects seem attractive, but carries still another, more important implication. It factors self-estrangement, which on its part entails identification with all kinds of objects. The dejected individual is likely to lose himself in the incidental configurations of his environment, absorbing them with a disinterested intensity no longer determined by his previous preferences. His is a kind of receptivity which resembles that of Proust's photographer cast in the role of a stranger. Filmmakers often exploited this intimate relationship between melancholy and the photographic approach in an attempt to render visible such a state of mind. A recurrent film sequence runs as follows. The melancholy character is seen strolling about aimlessly. As she proceeds, his changing surroundings take shape in the form of numerous juxtaposed shots of house facades. neon lights, stray passers-by, and the like. It is inevitable that the audience should trace their seemingly unmotivated emergence to his dejection and the alienation in its wake. The formative tendency may not only become so weak that the resultant prints just barely fulfill the minimum requirement, but it may also take on portions which threaten to overwhelm the realistic tendency. During the last few decades, many a noted photographer has indulged in pictures which are either meant to explore the given raw material or serve to project inner images of their authors, or both. Characterizing a photograph of tree trunks with eye-like hollows in their bark, Macaulay Nagy observed, quote, "The surrealist often finds images in nature which express his feelings," end quote. Or think of Macaulay Nagy's own picture from Berlin Wireless Tower and certain abstract or near abstract compositions which on closer inspection reveal themselves to be rock and soil formations and are unconventional combinations of objects, faces in big close-up, and whatnot. In pictures of this type, the balance between empathy and spontaneity is rather fragile. The photographer producing them does not subordinate his formative impulses to his realistic intentions, but seems eager to manifest both of them with equal vigor. He is animated, perhaps without being aware of it, by two conflicting desires: the desire to externalize his inner images and the desire to render out shapes. However, in order to reconcile them, he realizes on occasional coincidences between those shapes and images. Hence the ambiguity of such photographs, which are a veritable tour de force. A good case in point is Mary Ann Doer's photograph, Chairs in the Sunlight. On the one hand, it does justice to the properties of the medium. The perforated chairs in the shadows they cast do exist. On the other, it is palpably intended as an artistic creation. The shadows in the chairs affect one as elements of a free composition rather than natural objects. Unsettled borderline cases like these certainly retain a photographic quality if they suggest that their creators are devoted to the texture of nature, and they are on the verge of losing that quality if the impression prevails that the photographer's, quote, finds, end quote, merely reflect what he has already virtually found before training his camera on the external world. Then he does not so much explore nature as utilize it for a pseudo-realistic statement of his own vision. He might even manufacture the coveted coincidence between his spontaneous imagery in actuality by slightly tampering with the latter. The experimental photographer tends to trespass the border region marked by these blends of divergent intentions. Are his products still in the nature of photographs? Photograms or rayographs dispense with the camera and those, quote, creative, end quote, achievements which do not radically consume by molding it. the recorded raw material possibly going into them. The same holds true of photo montage. It might be best to classify all compositions of this type as a special genre of the graphic arts rather than photography proper. Despite their obvious affiliations with photography, they are actually remote from it. Indeed, as we have seen, the experimental photographers themselves assert that their prints belong to a peculiar medium and, being artistic creations, should not be confused with such quasi-abstract records of reality as are, perhaps, no less attractive aesthetically. But if these creations are no records, James Thrall, what was I? Blah, blah, blah. But if these creations are no records, they do not. But if these creations are no records, they do not fall into the dimensions of paintings or drawings either. James Thrall Sobey once remarked of them that they do not, quote, wear well when hung as pictures, end quote. It is as if the use of photography for strictly artistic purposes led into a sort of no man's land somewhere between reproduction and expression. Affinities. Photographs in keeping with the photographic approach, where no misunderstanding is possible, they may just be called photographs, show certain affinities which can be assumed to be as constant as the properties of the medium to which they belong. 4 of them call for special attention. First, photography has an outspoken affinity for unstaged reality. Pictures, which strike us as intrinsically photographic, seem intended to render nature in the raw, nature as it exists independently of us. Now, nature is particularly unstageable if it manifests itself in ephemeral configurations which only the camera is able to capture. This explains the delight of early photographers in such subjects as, quote, an accumulation of dust in a hollow molding, end quote, or a, quote, causal gleam of sunshine, end quote. It is worth mentioning that Fox Talbot, it was he who exclaimed over the sunbeam, was still so little sure of the legitimacy of his preferences that he tried to authenticate them by invoking the precedent of the, quote, Dutch school of art, end quote. In the field of portraiture, it is true, photographers frequently interfere with the given conditions, but the boundaries between staged and unstaged reality are very fluid in this field, and a portraitist who provides a special setting or asks his model to lower the head a bit may well be trying to bring out the typical features of the client before his lens. What counts is his desire to picture nature at its most characteristic so that his portraits look like causal self-revelations, quote, instinct with the illusion of life, end quote. If, on the other hand, the expressive artist in him gets the better of the imaginative reader or curious explorer, his portraits inevitably turn into those ambiguous borderline cases dealt with above. They give you the impression of being over-composed in terms of lighting and or subject matter. They no longer catch reality in its flux. You feel, but arrange its elements into a pattern reminiscent of painting. Second, Through this concern with unstaged reality, photography tends to stress the fortuitous. Random events are the very meat of snapshots. Quote, we want to seize in passing upon all that may present itself unexpectedly to our view and interest us in some respect, end quote, said a Frenchman about instantaneous photography nearly 10 years before the first films appeared. Hence the attractiveness of street crowds. By 1859, New York stereographs took a fancy to the kaleidoscopic mingling of vehicles and pedestrians, and somewhat later, Victorian snapshots revealed in the same inchoate agglomerates Marville, Stieglitz, Atget, all of them, as has been remarked, acknowledge city life as a contemporary and photogenic major theme. Dreams nurtured by the big cities thus materialized as pictorial records of chance meetings, strange overlappings, and fabulous coincidences. In portraiture, by the same token, even the most typical portraits must retain an accidental character, as if they were plucked en route and still quivered with crude existence. This affinity for the adventitious again implies that the medium does not favor pictures which seem to be forced into an, quote, obvious compositional pattern, end quote. Of course, photographs of the compositional inventions of nature or man-made reality are quite another thing. Third, photography tends to suggest endlessness. This follows from its emphasis on fortuitous complexes, which represent fragments rather than wholes. A photograph, whether portrait or action picture, is in character only if it precludes the notion of completeness. Its frame remarks a provisional limit. Its content refers to other contents outside that frame, and its structure denotes something that cannot be encompassed, physical existence. 19th century writers call this something nature or life, and they are convinced that photography would have to impress upon us its infinity. Leaves, which they counted among the favorite motifs of the camera, cannot be quote staged, end quote, but occur in endless quantities. In this respect, there is an analogy between the photographic approach and the scientific investigation. Both probe into the inexhaustible universe whose entirety forever eludes them. Fourth and finally, the medium has an affinity for the indeterminate of which Proust was keenly aware. Within the passage partially quoted, Proust also imagines the photograph of the academician leaving the institute. What the photograph shows us, he observes, quote, will be instead of the dignified emergence of an academician who is going to hail a cab. His staggering gait, his precautions to avoid tumbling upon his back, the parabola of his fall, as though he were drunk or the ground frozen over, end quote. The photograph Proust has in mind does not imitate that the academician must be thought of as being undignified. It simply fails to tell us anything about his behavior in general or his typical attitudes. It so radically isolates a momentary pose of the academician that the function of this pose within the total structure of his personality remains everybody's guess. The pose relates to a context which itself is not given. Photographs, implies Proust, transmit raw material without defining it. No doubt Proust exaggerates the indeterminacy of photographs just as grossly as he does their depersonalizing quality. Actually, the photographer endows his pictures with structure and meaning to the extent to which he makes deliberate choices. His pictures record nature and at the same time reflect his attempt to assimilate and decipher it. Yet, as in pointing up the photographer's alienation, Proust is again essentially right, for however selective photographs are, they cannot deny the tendency toward the unorganized and diffuse which marks them as records. It is therefore inevitable that they should be surrounded with a fringe of indistinct multiple meanings. To be sure, the traditional work of art carries many meanings also, but due to its rise from interpretable human intentions and circumstances, the meanings inherent in it can virtually be ascertained, whereas those of the photograph are necessarily indeterminate because the latter is bound to convey unshaped nature itself. Nature, in its inscrutability, as compared with a photograph, any painting has a relatively definite significance. Accordingly, it makes sense to speak of multiple meanings, vague meaningfulness, and the like only in connection with camera work. Appeals. Products of a medium with so outspoken affinities may well exert specific appeals differing from those of the art media proper. Three such appeals are discernible. We know, says Newhall, that subjects, quote, can be misrepresented, distorted, faked, and even delight in it occasionally, but the knowledge still cannot shake our implicit faith in the truth of a photographic record, end quote. This explains a common reaction to photographs since the days of Daguerre. They have been valued as documents of unquestionable authenticity. Baudelaire, who scorned both art's decline into photography and photography's pretense to art, at least admitted that photographs have the merit of rendering and thus preserving all those transient things which are entitled to a place in the, quote, archives of our memory, end quote. It would be difficult, indeed, to overestimate their early popularity as souvenirs. There is practically no family which does not boast an album crowded with generations of dear ones before varying backgrounds. With the passing of time, these souvenirs undergo a significant change of meaning. As the recollections they embody fade away, they increasingly assume documentary functions. Their impact as photographic records definitely overshadows their original appeal as memory aids. Leafing through the family album, the grandmother will re-experience her honeymoon, while the children will curiously study bizarre gondolas, obsolete fashions, and old young faces they never saw. And most certainly they will rejoice in discoveries pointing to old bagatelles which the grandmother failed to notice in her day, or think of the satisfaction people are deriving from the scrutiny of an enlargement in which one by one things emerge they would not have suspected in the original print, nor in reality itself for that matter. This too is a typical reaction to photographs. In fact, we tend to look at them in the hope of detecting something new and unexpected, a confidence which pays tribute to the camera's revealing faculty. Finally, photography has always been recognized as a source of beauty, yet beauty may be experienced in different ways. All those who do not expect a photograph to impress them as would a painting are agreed that the beauty of, say, Nadar's portraits, Brady's Civil War scenes, or Atget's Paris streets is inseparable from their being sensitive and technically impeccable readings rather than autonomous creations. Generally speaking, photographs stand a chance of being beautiful to the extent that they comply with the photographic approach. This would account for the frequent observation that pictures extending our vision are not only gratifying as camera revelations but appeal to us aesthetically also, no matter for the rest whether they result from high selectivity or amount to purely mechanical products like the aerial reconnaissance photographs. Fox Talbot called it one of the quote charms end quote of photographs that they include things unknown to their maker, things which he himself must discover in them. Similarly, Louis Deluc, one of the key figures of the French cinema after World War I, took aesthetic delight, in the surprising revelations of Kodak pictures. Quote, "This is what enchants me. You will admit that it is unusual suddenly to notice on a film or a plate that some passerby inadvertently picked up by the camera lens has a singular expression that Mr. X preserves the, or Madamo's, yeah, I'll just say Mr. X preserves the unconscious secret of classic postures and scattered fragments, and that the streets, the water, the fabrics, the beast achieve the familiar rhythm which we know is peculiar to them only by means of decomposed movements whose disclosure proves upsetting to us." End quote. The aesthetic value of photographs would, in a measure, seem to be a function of their exploitative powers. In our response to photographs, then, the desire for knowledge and the sense of beauty interpenetrate one another. Often photographs radiate beauty because they satisfy that desire. Moreover, in satisfying it by penetrating unknown celestial spaces and the recesses of matter, they may afford glimpses of designs beautiful in their own right. The issue of art. At this point, the controversial issue of whether or not photography is an art comes into view again. The controversy in its present form is strongly determined by the unwillingness of the champions of creativity to put up with the limitations which the photographic process imposes upon their formative urges. They consider any photographer who is following the photographic approach something less than an artist and, on their part, revolt against the recording duties he readily assumes. The issue, as they see it, could not be more poignantly characterized than by Macaulay Nagy's definition of the experimental photographer as an artist who, quote, will not only select what he finds, but produce situations, introduce devices so far unused and neglected, which for him contain the necessary qualities of photographic expression, end quote. The emphasis is on the elimination of accidental reality for the sake of art. Barbara Morgan, who builds a universe of her own with the aid of synchroflash and speed lamps, declares that she is, quote, grateful for man-made light and the creative freedom it gives, end quote. Yet much as the concept of art or creativity behind the statements applies to the traditional arts, it fails to do justice to the high degree of selectivity of which photographic records are susceptible. To be more precise, it overshadows the photographer's peculiar and truly formative effort to represent significant aspects of physical reality without trying to overwhelm that reality, so that the raw material focused upon is both left intact and made transparent. No doubt this effort carries aesthetic implications. Stiglitz's group of huddled trees is a memorable image of autumnal sadness. Cartier-Bresson's snapshots capture facial expressions and interrelationships between human figures and architecture which are strangely moving. And Bresson knows how to make walls and wet cobblestones eloquent. Why, then, reserve the term, quote, art, end quote, for the free compositions of the experimental photographers which, in a sense, lie outside the province of photography proper, question mark. This threatens to divert the attention from what is really characteristic of the medium. Perhaps it would be more fruitful to use the term, quote, art, end quote, in a looser way so that it covers, however inadequately, achievements in a truly photographic spirit. Pictures, that is, which are neither works of art in the traditional sense nor aesthetically indifferent products. Because of the sensibility that goes into them and the beauty they may breathe, there is something to be said in favor of such an extended usage. And I was reading the Introduction to Theory of Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality by Siegfried Kracauer.